So we talked about it a little bit toward the top, is understanding the difference between isolation and solitude. And so if we've struggled with isolation in the past, we've already talked about there's this fear that solitude could actually be tiptoeing back into isolation. How can we learn to develop healthy times of solitude?
Yeah, I think of an example I got to have recently. As we mentioned in the introduction, I had a time of sabbatical, and during that sabbatical, I spent a few days at a monastery, and a whole story about that place. It's really, really a cool experience. I
appreciate the gift that you got me from the monastery too. That was cool. Yep.
Yeah, but what's unique about that is I spent the better part of 3 days without human interaction. I went to some of the chapel services that the monks do. I had someone else I ended up meeting, but most of the time was just alone. And there are times
back with
in
your
my
hair
life
too, by the way.
That would have been torture. Like that would have been
Really?
so hard.
Okay.
It would have been so triggering. But in that situation, it was beautiful. It was freeing. And the reason is it was really my mindset, because my mindset was I am here for renewal and for what will help me grow closer to Christ, feel more centered, feel more at peace with who I am and what God is doing in my life, and spend a lot of time not doing much at all. I mean, it would have looked like I was procrastinating maybe. I was going for a walk. I was writing in my journal. I was reading a book. And it was so renewing because of that mindset of this is what I'm here for. And I think when we look at our life, now we're not all going to spend much time in a monastery, and I get that. But I do think we can look at a week, a month, a year, and just see places where, when I isolate, when I choose to be alone,
there you go.
That's solitude that is helping me. Whether it's your devotional time or, I've talked about a lot for me going for a run. I think for others it might be forms of exercise that maybe we don't do with other people. And it's not because we're isolating, but we know this is actually helping me be healthy, which makes me better for other people.
Yeah.
Or, I know some people they're just so people driven that it's hard for them to go to bed in a good rhythm. And for them, it might be at 10 p.m. they disengage and it feels like they're letting people down. But in a way, they're choosing some solitude to make sure they get a full night of rest. Well, the truth is, if you're well rested, how are you going to be the next day for your coworkers, your friends, your family? Like,
totally.
You're a better person, right? But if I stay up till midnight, 1 a.m. because I'm texting people and have to be on and email because I don't want to say no to anybody, and I don't want to feel like I'm isolating from them, and then I only get 5 hours of sleep and I wake up and I'm grumpy and grouchy. I was like, well, your solitude, some time to disengage. Luke 5:16 talks about that Jesus often withdrew from quiet places to pray.
Yeah.
If you talk a guy that had a pretty important agenda
right.
and a narrow window to do it in, like as we look back, he essentially 3.5 years, everything he did happened in that window. Like he didn't have much spare time, quote unquote, to just go on vacation, right? But here he is frequently withdrawing from crowds that were loving his preaching, people that were probably finding faith because of his healing. And he's taking time for solitude, to pray, to be alone, to be with the Father. And it was probably really confusing to some of his disciples and others, like, where are you going? Like, there's something to do here.
Yeah.
Like, no, I know what I need. Jesus knew what he needed. And to withdraw in that way was actually keeping him able to engage as God had called him to. So I think what we really have to do is identify what are those things for me that do require I withdraw, but for a purpose, for a part of my rhythm, because I know the way it's going to breathe life into everything else that I do. And none of us do it perfectly. I think that's where I hesitate to bring up the example of Jesus, because it's like, well, he was Jesus. But on the other hand, if he can do it, he can help us do it too, and move towards that kind of a life where we're really comfortable knowing our limits, knowing what we can and can't do, and then being able to communicate that to people to say, I'm doing this not to isolate, but because of my needs to be with the Father, to have some alone time, to get rested, to be renewed and refreshed. And if everyone doesn't get it, but you understand why it's helping you, that's the key. And then for those that are in your circle, being able to explain to them that rhythm so that they can be a part of supporting it. You don't want your spouse or close friends having those same questions of, why is he doing this when it really is a good thing? Well, make sure you tell them. I'm just bringing up
Yeah.
that like the public at large doesn't have to understand if you're
Right.
unavailable at
Right.
certain times or certain days,
Yeah.
because you know the importance of that rhythm.
But if your wife is like, you've been at the monastery every single week for 3 days at a time, what are you doing?
Which, hey, I mean, full disclosure, that's another story. The timing of that did not end up being great for our family. And if you asked my wife about it, it was not a positive experience. And we've worked through that, and I think we're okay. But
Yeah.
all that to say, even as we're trying to pursue solitude, we
Yeah.
can sometimes do it in a way that
Totally.
that didn't work out perfectly, and I just had to own that, and
Yeah.
you know, we're working through it. So,
And just to practically apply what you've said, I think the question I tend to ask about, because I think there's a trial and error, especially if you're just learning how to do solitude or for spending time alone and not isolating, is evaluating at the end of that practice or that activity, asking the question, does this make me a better version of myself, or does this put me into a worse headspace? And that's going to take some time, because I learned through practice that I like going to see movies by myself. And that may seem like isolation to a lot of people, but like clockwork, every time I come home from that, I'm in a better spot. And it doesn't matter how violent the movie was or how funny the movie was. The fact that I got to go alone, I didn't have to meet anybody's expectation, which there's something in there my therapist could probably help me unpack later. But I just, like clockwork, every time I come back, I'm in a better spot. And so I think asking that question and giving yourself that grace to evaluate, I think is helpful.